The Dickheads are presented in color.
Hey, Dickheads! Like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from Cincinnati, Ohio, and San Diego, California to your brain hole. I am your single host today. It's just me, one dickhead. But this is a bonus episode to go with our coverage for the Divine Invasion. And I have a special guest here to talk about PKD and the Kabbalah, because that is an issue that comes up quite a bit in the Divine Invasion, and it's something I didn't really know much about. Everyone knows the religious stuff with PKD is not my biggest strength. That being said, I want to learn about it. I want to know about it. And our guest today, Aaron, and how does your last name pronounce? Varady?
That's right.
Yeah.
Varady.
Aaron was recommended to us by a friend of the show, David Gill, who, as soon as I said I was working on the notes for the Divine Invasion episode, he said, I know somebody you should have on. So Aaron's here today. Aaron, tell us how you got interested in PKD, how you discovered his work. How did you start reading Philip K. Dick?
My 8th grade English teacher handed me, sometime before I finished elementary school, she handed me a huge cardboard box filled with her late husband's science fiction paperback collection. And among those was maybe 5 or 6 of Philip K. Dick's books. And I think also the Blade Runner reprint, or the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, retitled as Blade Runner. And that just sat around on my bookshelf for a few years. And then, I don't know, it probably was while I was in college, I read through it. I had seen the film, and I said, I want to read the book. And I read it, and it was quite different. And
just a little bit, yeah. But a lot of us, that was our first PKD novel, was that edition of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, right?
And it made me want to read more. I mean, for me, what struck was this thing about animals being put in a dangerous situation, and that being a test for one's empathy, and this whole empathy test, and now a non-human might express empathy more than a human being. That just blew my mind, and I wanted more of that, and I found it, so I was hooked.
Right. And so now it's okay if you haven't, but because not everyone has read everything, about what percentage do you think you've read of PKD, or have you read it all?
I'm nowhere close. I mean,
that's fine. I didn't want to sound like I was shaming. That's.
I would like.
There's several I haven't read yet because I'm reading them in order for the podcast. So.
Yeah, I kind of I'm waiting for the definitive which books to read in what order, and maybe that's a 2-column chart, in what order for the paracosm for his in-universe books to read in order, and what books to read that make sense chronologically from a scholar's perspective.
Yeah, Cliff Jones just did that. He did an article kind of proposing a mega novel with the timeline. I personally, we in the podcast did it in publication order, and I was pretty happy with that. Although when you do it that way, I found that Ubik is less impressive than when it's one you just kind of discover on its own. Do you have any personal favorites?
Yeah, I do. It's got to be Martian Time Slip, and then for the 2 short stories, it's The Black Box, and it's a companion short story. It's the name of that 19th century hymn. It's in Harlan Ellison's Impossible. What is it? I can see the cover of it. Something of Our Fathers.
Oh, Faith of Our Father. Oh, it's
Faith of Our
from
Father.
Dangerous Visions. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
vision.
yeah, yeah. Faith of Our Fathers, I believe it is, but I know what you're talking about from Dangerous Visions. If I got the title wrong, everyone can call me a poser later. Uh, yeah, those are good ones. Martian Time Slip was a controversial one. I was the one who is the biggest fan of it on our show, but I know author Brian Evanson agrees with you that Martian Time Slip is up there. So all right, so you're a Martian Time Slip fan. I got it, and Do Androids got you going, much like the rest of us. So all right, so how did your interest in PKD and the Kabbalah happened? You wrote this paper it was for the Fullerton conference, right? And this was before
Yeah.
my Dick scholarship, so like I wasn't. That's why I wasn't there yet. But tell me about how this paper happened.
Yeah.
Or am I skipping a step?
No, I'm just wondering. I'm thinking back about like when I started getting some sense that like Jews and Judaism was a topic that Philip K. Dick was animating him. I didn't know anything about.
Yeah,
I
especially Martian time slip too, because with the kibbutz and
Oh, you're
Israel
right.
having a major settlement on Mars and all that too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think probably it had to be in Man in the High Castle, because Frank Frink's character, it wasn't such like a deep character, but it really expressed a certain kinds of like alternate universe American Jewish fellow who was like fairly well assimilated and acculturated and yet still very, oppressed, and his identity was coming through that. And that, in my experience, that sounded a lot like Philip K. Dick had talked to friends of his who were Jewish and whose identity wasn't maybe so rooted in a religious Judaism, but it was very well defined by their American experience. And so he seemed to be like, that seemed to be something he was thinking about. And then I think when I came to Valis, I started getting like this other sense. I mean, there was already this thing with animals that was he was really thoughtful about animals. And for me, like a very important part of like my religious Jewish identity came when I learned when I was very young about the mitzvot, or like the rabbinic Jewish commandments concerning the treatments of animals. And it was a connection we had. And then I found out in reading his philosophical essay collection that this was more deeply rooted in something he had read. So things developed little pieces here and there, and I just wondered like who's written on this, like where is this where is this described? And I really wasn't coming up with anything, and I still hadn't followed in the footsteps of other people who had really tried to understand his like deep investigations into esoteric Christianity, and Gnosticism, let alone Judaism. I mean, he was all over. He was all over the place between the I Ching and all sorts of things. So who knows where to start? He's a boon for any scholar of religion, I think.
Well, totally, because from my understanding, where a lot of it, the exegesis looks like gobbledygook to a lot of us who are not big time religious scholars, but when experts on the Essenes or Kabbalah or whatever, like they look at this and they're super impressed. Whereas, it's like all stuff that goes over most of our heads. So I think he was operating on a level of knowledge of these things that was pretty intense. And if you think about it, the last, you know, I don't know, 8 years of his life, he just spent so much time thinking about all that stuff. Me personally, I should just, for for my family, my father was Jewish and very religious Jewish, but because my mother wasn't, and because of a lot of drama that went on in my family when he married my mother in the early 60s, this was a big, he was kicked out of the family and everything for a while. It wasn't until his children were born that, the family kind of got over that. But because of that, he and my mother had decided they weren't going to raise us with religion. So even when my mother passed away and he got very deep into Judaism, he didn't want to put it on us. So it's funny because I have some cultural connections to Judaism, but there was a degree that my father like kind of wanted to keep me away from it. So I have more than passing knowledge of Judaism, but I'm obviously not I'm secular Jewish culturally, I guess I should say. That being said, I find it really interesting because Phil, I don't think he knew a lot of Jewish people, especially living part of the time in either in Berkeley or rural California. He might have known more in Berkeley, but it seems to be that in these last couple of years, living in conservative Orange County is where he really started studying these issues, right? So I'm sorry, that's a lot of words. Just giving you my
Well,
background.
um, I don't want to pass this question back over to the biographers. I wish I could speak more about this. It would be better if I had a ready answer. But I think he knew plenty, and he had plenty of close friends. And I'm not just talking about fellow science fiction authors, close colleagues,
That's
in the
true.
field,
Avram Davidson was very Jewish
but
too. Yeah,
also, I mean, also professionally, there are his editors, um,
that's
and
true.
his agent, and I mean, this thing that I wrote about at the end of the paper is kind of like an appendix where I speculate that Frank Frink is based on a real person.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, yeah, we'll get into
Richard
Richard
Rubenstein,
Rubenstein
who he didn't
later.
know personally, but who he was sort of like, as the new husband, he was like filling his place, and he was also acquiring Richard Rubenstein's library also. So there's
Interesting.
so he was coming into a very intimate space inhabited by this very melancholy Jewish man who post Holocaust took his life. Um, a very, and I don't know enough about Richard Rubenstein to say, oh, he was a sensitive poet. But he is part of this generation that um, were survivors. They were survivors in a community who had to deal with learning just the depth of what it meant to be a surviving Jew in a world that one third of the entire global population of Jews had been exterminated.
Right, and we should explain who, for listeners who don't know who Richard Rubenstein is, he was Anne, Phil's third wife's first husband, who died kind of in a weird. He got a bad prescription, and and yeah, and he was from a wealthy family, and he who had basically bought the house that Phil ended up living in, and Anne and Richard moved out to Northern California, and then he passed away shortly after that. And then, so Phil kind of stepped into his life a little bit, like you're saying, by when he left Cleo for Anne. And so, if people want to get more details on that relationship, a good place is Anne Dick's The Search for Philip K. Dick, which one of the reasons why this I just read that book a month ago, so it's fresh in my head. But um, but yeah, I think you're right on that. I stand corrected because you're right. He did work with a lot of, well, for example, Don Woolheim. well, he was a secular Jew, um, wasn't very religious at all, but was also raised in the tradition. Judith Merrill is another uh, secular Jew who was raised Jewish, who he had written letters with. So they were definitely out there. So I guess I should correct myself on that. But
There's
um,
also his girlfriend in the 60s after Ann Dick. Um,
oh yeah,
um, and
uh,
she, and she was, she was a religious Jew. She
Grania,
passed, she was at, yeah. Um,
yeah,
and Avram Davidson, of course, who was her husband, was also a friend of his. So, um, and like, even though we talk about Jews who are secular versus religious, or so-called cultural Jews versus secular, it's important to know, like, even though somebody might not have been religious, they could have been very culturally fluent, or even like fluent in Yiddish or something. So their degree of being able to discuss with him things that um, he would have wanted an interlocutor, um, is, I think, is an open question. It's an open question for me, like what he could have talked about with, say, Norman Spinrad or Avram Davidson, and what he wasn't able to, or who he had to search, who he needed to search for in order to talk about things that he wouldn't have been able to find answers for in the 1970s, when he was more focused on.
right. In the '60s, and it's true because we had Don Wollheim, his editor at Ace Books. We had his daughter on the podcast, and she pointed out that he was not very religious at all, but he was raised in a very Jewish household, and like the Jewish cultural identity was very important to him. Uh, for example, so it's and I think that that's true of several of the well-known Jewish science fiction writers in that era. So
Yeah, that's a kind of really important nuance of identity that we should probably talk about when we're talking about Jewish identity, and this, I'm sure, follows for other kinds of religio-ethnic identities. If that nuance is lost, it can be really, people miss out on a lot that's going on.
exactly, yeah. So let's get into some of the aspects of your paper. Um, I thought one thing that you talked about that's really interesting is when you talked about the German translation of Ubik, which is really interesting because it gets into like kind of what Phil's concept of God is itself. Because the German translation of Ubik is really interesting. It is "I am the brand name," right? Is the direct translation that they used. So tell me what you were thinking about there.
Should we read the little quote that I took out?
Sure, absolutely. And
Okay.
hi, cat. Um,
Hi, Henry. Hey, buddy. Um, okay, so this is PKD telling the story about the German translation of Ubik. He writes, he did all right until he got to the sentence, "I am the word." That puzzled him. What can the author mean by that? He must have asked himself, obviously never having come across the Logos doctrine. So he did as good a job of translation as possible. In the German edition, the absolute entity that made the suns, made the worlds, created the lives and the places they inhabit, says of itself, "I am the brand name." Had he translated the Gospel according to St. John, I suppose it would have come out as, "When all things began, the brand's name already was. The brand's name dwelt with God, and what God was, the brand's name was." And here the brand name is a translation of this amazingly important theological term, logos, which literally means the word,
Right.
or and maybe on its basis means a decree, a divine decree. But in the particular conception of early Judaism, decrees are passed over by numinous entities, angelic powers or messengers. And so a decree has a kind of life force of its own. And what exactly was this logos by which uh, John was speaking becomes a really important pivot for Christian thinkers, and also for early rabbinic Jewish thinkers. They're not, they're in the same thought world. Maybe they're in different ballparks already, but they're in the same thought world. I'll say, arguably.
Right. Well, and so what's interesting is because like he's trying to, you know, it's funny because I was thinking that the German translator is also trying to get into the concept of the book as much as just like the idea of what does it mean to be the creator of all things, but I don't know. For me, that's what I took from it is that the German translator was trying to go with the concept of the book a little bit. But what I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that it relates so much to like this higher religious thinking that Phil was kind of going for much later, actually, because Ubik was written in the late 60s, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is still before his February 1974 experience. So in my mind, it's kind of still early. Like I guess I separate Dick into the before and after, and
Before and after the pink beam, right?
yeah, and logos is just such a seminal idea for Christians. It's not like a term that is like readily used by Jews, but the idea of divine decrees um, and being affected by them is certainly part of the world of Jewish storytelling. If there is a decree that is ominous in the worlds of Jewish storytelling, you might be visited by the figure of Elijah the prophet to warn you. And if you have a very bad dream that seems to bode ill, it could be possibly prophetic, and it behooves one to gather together a group of friends to judge that dream for the good and change that decree from something that's ominous and terrible to something which is positive. So you're not actually off the mark with thinking about logos as book. Um, Philip K. Dick, I think, could have thought that, as well as thinking of logos in other terms, as the plasmate, as this living entity, because the way logos is thought of, at least in the midrashic literature, logos has a pretty strong parallel to a conception of the Torah itself, or the Hebrew Bible itself, which isn't just one book, but intertextually many books together.
And the Torah takes on kind of a living spirit type thing, right? Because it's like more. I mean, correct me. I mean, I could be wrong because, like I said, it's passing interest. But it's
All
like
right.
because the thing is, each synagogue has its own Torah, but I think it's all part of the same tradition, right? It's supposed to be the one same word, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Um, there's a teaching in esoteric Judaism from a medieval Jewish teacher, a rabbi named Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides, but Nachmanides taught that, among the esoteric divine names that often have many, many letters, the Torah itself, with its 300,000 plus letters, is one long divine name. And Darren Aronofsky talks more about that in the movie Pi.
Right.
But for Logos, the idea of like the Torah being something like a blueprint or something that you would look at in order to create the world, or it being some kind of early nascent thing from which our world emerges. I think the textual basis for that is in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, where it says, I consulted Chachma, which means wisdom, and I created the world. Mm-hmm. And how this is understood in the Midrashic literature is that God looked at the Torah and used the Torah as a blueprint for all of creation.
Right. Now, in 1979, on the Legos issue, Phil got kind of defined it more clearly in writing, right? He was more clear about the influence of Jewish literature on him there, right?
Yeah, I think even earlier he points to some conversations that he had. Maybe he was still digesting them. By 1978, he definitely seems to be in a particular groove, deepening his knowledge. Maybe I would love to know who he was speaking with. I think that's like one of my big unanswered questions is
right.
Some of the best I could do is simply look at his quotes and put his quotes into, say, Google Books and find out, what was the source? What was the book that he was actually reading and quoting from? So I've been able to see like that he was reading Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Buber from some of the quotes he has from of, say, the Sefer Yetzirah, in an important early book of esoteric Judaism.
Well, and one wonders where he was getting these in Orange County, like, yeah, like I mean, some of this is like really deep cut Judaism, right? Like, I mean, like, and that's where you're saying it would be interesting to know who he was talking to, who was suggesting these books to him, right?
Yeah,
because we know some of his religious mentors, like Pike, but I don't know who was getting him into this intense Judaism.
And he was in California. Like, I think it's worth much more specific research into exactly what was going on in California in the 60s and 70s. And there's a lot of this first wave of English translation of esoteric Judaism that was coming out in the late 70s. Already, the works of Gershom Scholem in translation had come out, and so it wasn't impossible for someone who was already autodidactic, really curious, and nobody was going to say no to Philip K. Dick. If he could access something, like any curious person today, he's going to go to a library and make a request. If it's not in the stacks, I don't know if interlibrary loan was available, for him, but he would go to, he was very accustomed already since the late 40s to going into his academic library and to looking through, say, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Encyclopedia of Religion and following up footnotes to other things that might be useful. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's
if it was during the phases when he was leaving the house. Because there was also those phases where he wasn't leaving the house. That's why I'm wondering who was bringing him the books. Because especially in the late period of his life, he had periods of time where the only people who saw him outside of his house was the late night crew at the Ralph's down the street. So, somebody was breaking, and that's where I think that some of these people who were characters in Valis, right, who he turned into characters, or like Doris, who was his next door neighbor, who was a character in Valis and Divine Invasion. I'm wondering if she's finding these books for him, or if she's like, hey, Phil's really interested in this. I should find these books. I don't know, but it's impossible to say. But one thing, and
Maybe it is possible. Maybe it's still possible. I mean, there are folks who are still around, William Cyril and other friends who've mentioned, people who are, now kind of hard to track.
Yeah.
And possibly they'll be hearing this podcast. And so let's put out an open invitation. Like, if
Absolutely. If you know the answers to these things, please comment.
If you were present at one of these, open-ended conversations with Philip K. Dick in the late 70s, and he mentioned some of these things, or somebody was talking about one of these.
Absolutely.
The topic of Judaism came up. Like, who were they? Like, and what kind of books did they bring with them to his house?
Absolutely. Well, and that's the thing is we don't, none of us pretend to know it all with Phil, and so if people could fill in those gaps, that would be incredible. And this might be left field. This isn't something that was in your article, but it's something that you kind of brought up. And I'm sorry, I got a dog getting grumbly here. But the one of the things, like, listen, I've been a vegan for over 30 years, so I got an animal connection too, and animal rights is big and important to me. And I remember in the 90s, there was a lot of talk that when there was a lot of things about the Essenes and translations about how, there was a lot of pro-animal or things that like backed up animal rights in the Essene text. So I'm wondering if, coming on the heels of, some of the ideas that he's putting forward in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, if some of these concepts are backed up by some of the reading he was doing in these Essene texts and how that relates to this issue.
Well, that's a really great question. There's a scholar in Britain, her name is Taylor. I'm blanking whether her name is Jean or Julia, and forgive me, those out there who know her name well. She wrote a book on the Essenes, and she wrote another book on the Therapeutae, just bringing up all the scholarship on these people. And one of the conclusions she makes on her book on the Essenes is that they really weren't vegans, the Essenes, and vegetarianism wasn't their thing. I wasn't entirely convinced, because even if it wasn't their thing, it certainly seems important for
I could say so.
The early Christians that followed them to retroactively say they were. And why was that? And so there is a kind of there's something else that I wrote about besides this Philip K. Dick paper, which talks about sort of like the anti-predatory philosophy, or the anti-predatory mythos that was animating a lot of the storytelling and moralizing. It wasn't only current among the early Christians, it was also a current among Jews of that period too. I mean, it certainly wasn't felt by everyone. Otherwise, the Jewish and Christian communities would be like the Sikhs or Hindus and would have really formalized that into their dietary practice. But as everyone who knows something about kashrut or kosher, the kosher dietary tradition, the concept of something being treif, figuratively non-kosher, is that creature hadn't been torn apart. It hadn't been ripped apart, which is the manner in which every other animal in the world except humans can predate on other animals. They will eat them alive. But we can do things differently. So that's like sort of the limit for how we do things. And then when just for Jews in particular, then the way the animal is killed initially, for the longest time, this was a really big deal, that it was circumscribed very seriously in how that animal would be killed and which animals could be killed. But I think even to get back to your point, yes, Essenes might not have historically been vegans or uniformly anti-predatory, but the people after them certainly framed them as such, and that would have been what Philip K. Dick read about them.
Yeah, and I think some of those I think some of those ideas bleed into a little bit into some of the work, but now there's a book that Phil read that he was very influenced by, and I tried to put it on hold at the library. It did not get here in time for me to read it, and that's God in Search of Man by Abraham Herschel, I believe.
Heschel, Abraham
Heschel.
Joshua Heschel.
Heschel. That's right. And what can you tell me about this book and its influence on Phil?
I wish I could say more. I mean, he's certainly one of the most important Jewish thinkers of the 20th century in the United States. So if somebody was to be making a short list of thinkers who, by the skin of his teeth, it's a kind of interesting phrase to use, very narrowly avoided being killed by the Nazis, as other scholars, found his way to the United States thanks to the sanctuary at Hebrew Union College here in Cincinnati, where I am, made his way to JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, where he taught for years. The important thing about Heschel for many religious Jews who aren't necessarily Orthodox Jews is he brought to them a lineage of Hasidic thought. That's a particular stream of Jewish pietistic thought is sometimes the word that's used, but a certain stream of Jewish thought which is like very inclined to raise the level, or to not to make esoteric Judaism esoteric, but to make esoteric Judaism exoteric or public, or really part of a familiar area of Jewish thought, a lived Jewish thought. And Abraham Joshua Heschel came from that world of Hasidic Jewish life, and his conception of Torah and the symbolic world and prayer and a prayer life is full of that. And it was like extremely fresh for Jews who had come from a different stream of intellectual German Jewry that I wouldn't say was divorced from that, but maybe a bit alienated from that, was much more inclined towards an old school Maimonidean approach, which is philosophical, erudite, and averse to a mystical approach, or an openly mystical approach. Those things would tend to be either more private, or you'd have to prove yourself through a great deal of intellectual rigor in order for it to be a subject of your scholarship.
Well, and I got the impression from your paper that you thought that some of Phil's ideas of the Torah came directly from this God in Search of Man book. But am I right about that, or?
Godin's, like, Heschel and Buber seem to be, very, very important influencers for his thinking, as they would have been for many people who were exploring Jewish philosophy in the mid to late 20th century. I can say for myself, one of the first books that I read, it was a very slim novel, when I was a teenager that I came across was Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath, combined with another book called The Earth is the Lord's. And those two books like introduced me to Jewish environmental thought from somebody writing in the 1950s. So he's like he's not just a connection to like a pre-war, pre-Holocaust Judaism that was open to esoteric Judaism and the lived mystical Judaism, but he was also keeping with him a sort of engaged, forward-thinking Judaism that was very keen on expressing I don't know how to say it more profoundly, a Judaism that is keen on bringing the world into a state of rectification, an acknowledgement that there's something very broken about the world, and for a galactic pot healer mind, this is like a world that needs to be repaired. And he's speaking to a concept in Jewish mystical teaching called Tikkun Olam. And over the last 2 centuries, it became like a very potent, profound mission in religious Judaism for Jews to be social justice oriented along the lines of seeing the world as broken and wanting to do what they can through good deeds and organizing to make it better. And Heschel lived that. He lived that by walking with Martin Luther King and being and modeling that behavior and speaking loudly and openly about that in his life. And he's just a very, very important person who's straddling all those places. I think it would be worthwhile to like do a comparison. Like, in what way was Heschel sort of like how could he be compared to Bishop Pike? I wouldn't be surprised if they traveled in some of the same circles or knew some of the same people, just very concerned with society and the improvements of the world and for its most vulnerable.
Well, we're going to be diving into Pike in the next book because we're doing Transmigration of Timothy Archer, of course, after this. So I'll let you know if I see anything. But so here's the other thing, too. So I do want to say, because some of you might be out there wondering, like, you haven't even mentioned Divine Invasion yet. And this is a bonus for Divine Invasion. And we will get to a little bit but to me, it's more about the background of what Phil was thinking when he wrote Divine Invasion. It's going to inform your process when we discuss it as a book. And ideally, I want people to listen to that episode before they listen to this one. But that being said, Phil, what's the importance of Thomas? Because here's the thing: is Phil like straight up talked about? He told people he was literally collaborating with this mythical figure Thomas on the Valis books, meaning Valis and Divine Invasion, and probably a little bit of Radio Free. So you want to tell the folks who Thomas is and what that means for this story?
Well, Thomas comes from like the Gospel of Thomas, which isn't really something which many people who are Christian scholars or scholars of Gnostic literature know about. I wouldn't know about Thomas or the Gospel of Thomas if it wasn't for Philip K. Dick. So Thomas's own connection to Judaism is kind of is a big question mark in my mind. Maybe, but it becomes something significant for Philip K. Dick because he's interested in Gnostic literature, and so the Gospel of Thomas comes into his canon. And what's significant about the story of Thomas is Jesus isn't even mentioned. Thomas is the protagonist in that story, and it might be, it seems like a little bit more plausible to me that in the heady currents of um, the Hellenistic world, or the world of late antiquity, that the Gospel of Thomas was a popular religious work that was carried by not like a group of Christians that doesn't exist anymore, or maybe even non-Christians like Manichaeans. Um, you know, Manichaeans were another sect that spun off of Judaism in the first century, or what scholars might call early Judaism, and was ultimately extinguished by repression. But there are these stories that survived in places like Persia, and um, they were translated and they became part of the lore. And I'm not exactly sure I'm the best person to talk about the historical literature of Thomas. It's just a very it's an odd place to talk about Judaism specifically. It for the divine invasion. I mean, there are other more specific Jewish characters in divine invasion, or that are speaking to the weirdness in there. I mean, for one,
Well,
there's this.
he said in a letter to Charles Platt that for Valis, he said, quote, I am collaborating with the spirit of a 13th century Jewish Kabbalist, Abraham ben
Abraham
Samuel.
Abulafia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
so
So
he
that's
he
not
sees
Thomas.
Valis as a collaboration with this figure. Who is this figure? Is he created completely out of Phil's mind, or
No, no. This is another historical person. I mean, I would love. I I just don't want to ignore Thomas for the moment because he's really
okay,
interesting, and you have this whole thing going on, um, where Philip K. Dick has history stop and it's bifurcated, and our timeline continues, and at some points with some spirits, there's an overlapping, and so you can have you or me sharing the same person of somebody who is living
lived
in another
centuries ago? Yeah,
centuries ago, and so the possibility that he's doing that with somebody like Avram Abulafia or Maimonides or this fellow Thomas, or a Roman soldier who is subversively an early Christian. All these possibilities are in the mix. Um, but he speaks about this, like he says in this letter, he's channeling Avram Abulafia, and it's directing him in what he's writing about Valis. And unlike, I guess other people would say they'd read that and they'd say, well, Philip K. Dick has a sense of humor, and you can't really take what he's saying seriously.
right.
I also don't think one should deny what he's saying. I think he can be serious but not sober, to quote Hakim Bey. This is a man who he's plucking these names out of the air. They're inside jokes. For who? For him.
For
He
him, yeah.
knows the significance of Avram Abulafia. For
Well,
him,
I
maybe he
mean,
thinks for Charles too. Maybe he thinks Charles should know who he is, or in his own odd way is telling Charles, by the way, you should find out about this Avram Abulafia guy. He's really cool. He's sort of I knew about Avram Abulafia before he was cool. I was channeling him. Um, and
before he was all the rage. Well, and the thing is he's thinking of it the same way. Like Richard Linklater could have said, "I'm collaborating with Philip K. Dick on a movie" when he was doing Scanner Darkly, right? Because in a sense he was, and so for Phil, he may have been thinking that way, like I'm collaborating. And look, the book I'm writing right now, I could easily argue that I'm collaborating with Philip K. Dick because I'm writing so much about him. Um, that
well,
there's an argument for that. When you're channeling somebody, you're going through their work. I think of my friend John Shirley got to write that collection where all these different authors finished uncompleted Edgar Allan Poe stories. And like he took a story where Poe had stopped mid sentence, and finished it. Like so, he was collaborating with Edgar Allan Poe technically.
Well, I like that idea actually because um I think when PKD name checks Avram Abulafia, the only translated material by Abulafia was a piece, a fragment that Gershom Sholem had translated. I mean, it's a really important fragment at the time. I should mention why Abulafia is so significant. Like he's a messianic figure from the 13th century. He goes to the Pope at the time with an intention to try and turn him and change history, revealing to him like what should be. The Pope imprisons him, and this is actual history. It's unbelievable. Abulafia is sentenced to death, but overnight in jail, the Pope dies, and he's set free. Um, like, does this happen anywhere else? Like for Jews in the Middle Ages, such like uh, a miraculous close encounter with death. Where there is, usually there's a great story around it. For Abulafi, who's a controversial character, he's controversial because his own revelations, his declaration that he is a prophet and that he has a method for acquiring prophecy, already puts him in a dangerous position among fellow Jews in Spain. This is before the expulsion in 1492, where such declarations are kind of dangerous. Let me name check while I can also a fellow who's studying this, and a Philip K. Dick, also a passionate Philip K. Dick
Go for it.
enthusiast. His name is Avi Solomon, and he's busy in Israel translating works of Avram Abulafia, and he has a Patreon, and you can support him, and what he's translating is really important. His thesis is that Abulafia had gotten via Arabic certain really important breathing techniques that were current from Indian philosophy. These were Indian breathing techniques, and he had learned them from their Arabic translation. He had himself translated them into Hebrew. Abulafia's writings are really incredible. His connection to Maimonides is that he interpreted Maimonides in a mystical fashion, which would have been a huge surprise to Maimonides, who was more of a rationalist, Aristotelian thinker. But Abulafia really starts this current among medieval Jewish mystics to reread the works of Maimonides, the philosopher, in a mystical way. And that's probably what puts him on the map for Philip K. Dick. Maimonides would be really surprised, I think, to learn that a science fiction writer in the 20th century would think that he could be possessed by him. Again, Maimonides is a rationalist, not a mystic, but there's this huge current to
That's kind of funny to think about.
Maimonides in a mystical way. And that current is extremely important in medieval Jewish thought, that reinterpretation of Maimonides. And Abulafia is part of that.
Yeah. So to try and reel this home, you refer to, in your article, you said the divine invasion is sort of a Kabbalistic allegory. Something to do also with the I mean, we've got the cryo lab where you have like the Fiddler on the Roof playing, and there's lots of little inside. People forget a lot of times. People who are not serious dickheads forget that Phil uses humor in such brilliant ways. Can you talk about like how the divine invasion is related to Kabbalistic thinking?
Well,
That's a big question. I get it. I
it is. Can I just say that Fiddler on the Roof is such a cultural touchstone for so many non-Jews and Jews, um, that joke of Philip K. Dick strikes home for me in a very, very like hilarious and serious way.
right,
Because often when like I meet somebody, a stranger, um, that's like all they know about Judaism is from like our great cultural ambassador, Fiddler on the Roof. Um, but how much how much are people really like gleaning from that? Like, if I had my choice, would I choose Fiddler on the Roof as my cultural ambassador? Um, no, but Philip K. Dick is sensitive in making his joke that this is like he would say like Fiddler on the Roof playing endlessly. Like what is that doing to the mind of his protagonist in this cryosleep? To me, it points to a kind of a very superficial level of self-knowledge or Jewish
yes,
identity, and that's the role that he's playing in Divine Invasion. The character with deeper knowledge, the Virgil like mentor of what's his name, Herb Asher.
Asher, yeah,
Right, Herb Asher is the fellow in the cryo lab who's hearing Fiddler on the Roof endlessly. Um, this fellow Elisha, he is the manifestation of Elijah the prophet, and he opens up in the Divine Invasion this like possibility of like incarnate people manifesting these ancient spirits. So you have Elijah alive in the form of this fellow Elisha who's teaching, who's there teaching Herb Asher the Talmud, and you have um, Herb Asher's son Emmanuel, who is a deity reborn in the form of a man. Where have we heard that before? And he's being taught by the manifestation of Chachma, wisdom, with this like a Sophia wisdom character, this this small girl named Zena. Um, I I just find like the interaction between Xena and Emmanuel, where she's curing him of his anamnesis, this strange word that means like recovering a sacred memory, to be just entirely like sensitive and healing. It really just affects me profoundly when I read that portion. It's a description of an intervention, of a spiritual intervention, something that Philip K. Dick, I'm sure, desired tremendously, and
right.
he visualized it in his story.
Well, this is the last kind of hurrah for science fiction for Phil on a novel basis, and for the story of Herb Herb Asher. I mean, he isn't the first Jewish, kind of identify. He did a Jewish hero in Frank before, right? But but Frank was Jewish on the surface, whereas Herb's story is kind of Jewish under the surface. You know what I'm saying? Uh,
Yeah, and doesn't that parallel Philip K. Dick's own exploration of Judaism before and after his theophany?
very
When
true.
he talks about Jews or Judaism before, he's talking about it on the level of like critiques of ethno-nationalism or identity politics.
But
After
certainly with the way the kibbutz are portrayed in Merchant Time Slip. Yeah,
Yes, exactly,
there's some
and
like you know.
he has like a world's computer that makes like a kind of casual determination to simply eliminate the state of Israel from the globe. Like we're going to nuke Israel now, and it doesn't exist anymore because it's a minor variable in a confrontation between the Soviet Union and France. And so the supercomputer calculates its options and it obliterates
Was
Israel.
that was Holy Quarrel, right? The short
Yeah,
story. Okay.
but it
Yeah,
also
and then
appears in other stories. Um,
I know Israel was in Water Spider too, I think. But
that's right.
yeah, so which is funny because I'm usually not as strong on the short stories as I am the novels, but um,
Kudos.
well, but so here's the thing. I think you've made a really excellent point tying it together of like the pre and post, pink laser beam thing with Phil and Judaism is that he actually said in one of his final interviews, I've become something of an amateur student of Jewish scriptures.
Yeah.
Do you think that if he had lived longer I mean, I think if he had lived longer, we would have gotten a lot more movement in that direction. What do you think?
I mean, I think he brings a great deal. Um, I'm not a Christian thinker. I'm not a Christian mystic, but I am a religious Jew, and I feel like Philip K. Dick isn't a Jewish thinker, but what he writes, it lands with me, it touches me, and so I think he could, what he wrote and what he wrote in the near the end of his life, if it has the ability to touch me, then he's talking about things that matter, things that matter to me, not just like as a human being, but things that matter within the scaffolding of my religious education, and that's very special. Um, it's not gonna. I don't think that would connect with just about everybody on that level, you know, but that it did for me, just anecdotally.
Right. Well,
That
and I've
that
always wondered if he wouldn't it's funny because if he hadn't forget Eye in the Sky for a second, but um I always wondered if he hadn't been exposed to the Baha'i faith in a way because so much of the way he was kind of learning religion at the end was he was taking bits and pieces of everything, right? The same like this is, so now he wrote a kind of he wrote nastily about the Baha'i faith in Eye in the Sky, but that was because his editor Don Wollheim was told by his bosses, "Don't write about Christianity." So the original draft of Eye in the Sky was entirely about Christianity, and he had to, because it was the '50s, write it about this weird version of the Bob, right? And
I
so
didn't know that.
my thinking is, and this comes me as somebody who had taken interest in the Baha'i faith for a while. I wonder if he wouldn't have seen that kind of approach to taking bits and pieces of everything if he had gone further in life. But he was definitely
Maybe
obviously reading Jewish scriptures intensely during this time, and
Well,
it
he says
informed.
something about Judaism that's kind of weird. Well, which struck me as a misunderstanding of Judaism. He wrote that his issue with Judaism is that it repudiates the teachings of Jesus, and that's not what I think of in as Judaism. That was what Philip K. Dick at the time that he wrote that thought Judaism taught, but the Judaism that I know is the one that in Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the fathers, it says who is wise. Shimon ben Zoma says the one who is wise learns from every person. And so there's not like a repudiation of the teachings of Jesus, and more so, I think had he known that, he would have found like a kind of deeper resolution than even that he had come to when he wrote that, I think in 1981, which is in the Exegesis. But as somebody who's purposefully, intentionally trying to unpack a revelation, what he would self-describe as a theophany, Baha'i should have appealed to him, because what is remarkable about Baha'i is that there are prophets in every generation. Prophecy has not been discontinued. I mean, I think there's like a danger for people to for people who are egotistical or spiritual narcissists to say, I too am a prophet, and run with that. I didn't know Philip K. Dick personally, so I can't say whether he was like that. I don't get that sense from his writings, that he was going to be like a L. Ron Hubbard and make his own shtick. But I feel this is somebody who's a lot more intellectually honest and is struggling in a fairly tortured way to unpack what he had received. And that's something I deeply, deeply respect. I think it should have connected him with the experience of Baha'i and any other tradition that still holds that prophecy is something that every human being can access. That was something Avram Abulafia taught in the Middle Ages. And I don't, if he knew that about Avram Abulafia, I'm not surprised that this person who is maybe a failed prophet, I wouldn't say a false prophet, but somebody who experienced something really profound, that he could be respected for and not castigated or marginalized for having had his experience.
Do you have a lot of experience? I don't know. Do you often suggest to Jewish science fiction fans to check out Philip K. Dick, and how do you make that pitch?
What a really great question. Just an hour ago, somebody was asking on the Jewish Star, the what is it called? Star Trek Jew Posting Facebook group. They were asking about a story in which there's conversion to Judaism in our science fiction future. Please make recommendations. And I thought of Joseph Dan's 1992 story, Jumping the Road, which appeared in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. It's a really beautiful story. And there's a book by Isadora Hablum called The Tzaddik of the Seven Wonders, and I think Joseph Dan also did a very famous collection anthology of science fiction stories. There is an article in that came out about 12, 15 years ago that stated that Jews weren't into fantasy literature, but science fiction was their genre. And I'm also a romantic and a believer in the project of people like Tolkien. So it rubbed me the wrong way. I feel like Philip K. Dick talks about a speculative fiction and eschews the idea of a science fiction, but is more in a speculative mode. I feel like that rings really true in thinking about these genres as creating as a literature that creates a comparison view. The writer creates a world, and we as the readers see that world and we compare it against our own. And that experience of comparison, that can be radically subversive and a political, or it's apocryphal in the sense of it being revealing, or Gnostic in the sense of now we have experienced a hidden knowledge. But it's that kind of awakening to a different perspective feels like it's part of an ancient tradition of writers, revealers, prophets who are trying to, desperately trying to give us a new perspective. The difference for Philip K. Dick is, and for writers today, is that their work is commodified. So it's not simply that they're writing for the sake of, for some altruistic sake. They're doing it for their own livelihood. But somehow Philip K. Dick has managed to do it, and also, many of his peers, and are having fun with it. I would like to know somebody say, like, did Philip K. Dick actually enjoy writing? Did he? Was it a torture, like in unpacking his theophany? Did he have to take drugs to enter into the state of mind that was excruciating to bring over his
Yes.
thoughts? So that's, I think that's something a lot of us can relate to, that an altered state of perception is something that causes us anxiety, not something that we are euphoric for. It's something we appreciate, but it isn't something we would necessarily jump into for recreational purposes.
I did have some discussion on this podcast before about Jewish science fiction writers with, of course, Lavi Tidhar on the 10th anniversary of his novel Osama, very influenced by Man in the High Castle. If you have not read Osama by Lavi Tidhar, who is an Israeli science fiction writer. Okay, Aaron, you've been incredible, giving us all kinds of really intense details on Judaism and Philip K. Dick. But I know you and I could probably talk for hours on this because I'm really enjoying it. Well, if folks want to communicate with you or collaborate with you on or just talk to you about these issues, where can they find you? And is this something you're going to be writing about in the future?
Well, the paper that I gave in 2016, which you read, that's available right now. I guess it's been circulating for 6 years. I'm looking for comments.
It is a great article. I really appreciated that.
Thank you. Well, that's available. And I think in the zip file I have, along with the PDF, there's some other really precious, there's some MP3s of his interview with the fellow you mentioned earlier.
John Borstra, or sorry, the
There were two different interviews. There was that, and there was also
Boonstra.
Boonstra. So that's good, and if you provide the link to that, that's terrific. Of course, people are welcome to find me. I have a blog on the internet for like 20 years now, because I'm an internet old timer, and people can reach out to me through the contact form on my website, which is Aharon Varady.net/omphalos, OMPHALOS. I guess you might have that available for them in the description for this.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes too, for sure. So
yeah, and if you do a Google for me, I'm sure you'll find more. But that's where the contact form is. That's important if you wanted to connect.
Okay, any last comments you want to make on Philip K. Dick and Jewish thinking?
Well,
scriptures, divine invasion.
I did select one thing to share.
Awesome.
In my other world, in my other life that I work on a Jewish prayer literature, and this prayer from 1969 at the inauguration day for Richard M. Nixon really struck me when I first heard it, and I think it'll strike you, Philip K. Dick enthusiasts. So here it is. It's not terribly long. This is Edgar F. Magnin, Rabbi Edgar F. Magnin speaking. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This was not the light of the sun nor the moon. It was the Shekhinah, the Logos, the Word, the divine presence that was to reflect itself upon the human mind and soul. This is the light that brought man out of the cave and endowed him with intelligence, morality, the yearning for freedom, that inspired the prophets and sages of old and through all ages. This is the American ideal, born at the time of creation itself, cherished by the founding fathers who were practical idealists. They knew history well. They warned against the dangers of ignorance, stupidity, apathy, selfishness, immorality, and dissension within our borders and between nations. They knew full well that patience, courage, goodwill, and cooperation were preferable to hysteria and emotionalism, and that age-old problems and complex problems cannot be solved with instant answers and simple answers. They knew that there is no substitute in the world for common sense. The night is long and it is still dark. As far as civilization goes, we will never be perfect, for man is not perfect, but we are on the way. Our country is still great, and it will be greater with hope in our hearts and work and rededication. There are a few faint streaks of pink in the sky. We await the dawn. Almighty God, bless our country and him who will be our leader and our guide in the coming years. Our fathers, God, to the author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King.
On that note, folks, ride the beam, stay paranoid.